Hello again, everyone, and welcome to the podcast Byzantine and Friends. I'm Anthony, your host. I'm going to begin with a scheduling announcement. I'm going to be taking a little bit of a break from posting the episodes of the podcast. Don't be alarmed. I fully intend to continue. After about a month or a month and a half, I've actually already recorded some podcasts, so in all fairness to the guests, they need to be posted. But I enjoy doing this too much, so I fully intend to continue. But each of the podcasts is actually months in preparation and production. So between the time when I read someone's work or have an idea to drawing up questions and scheduling the recording and then editing and so forth, they take a long time. And so there's usually quite a few episodes that are in the pipeline at any time, and there are right now. So I'm actually working to record a number of episodes once I return to the U.S. in the fall. And I have one, and we'll have a few more recorded in the next few weeks. So I'm not slacking off completely, just a little bit. Need a little bit of a break. It's been 2 years, amazingly. And, I had originally intended for these to be a 10-episode series, and then I'd take a break after 10 episodes, then, later come back with another 10. But we've rushed forward to like 55 or whatever this is. Anyway, without a break for 2 years. So anyway, just a little bit of a pause. I'm not sure how I will let anybody know that I've resumed posting in probably mid to late September. I don't do social media, so I don't do announcements like that. But I guess you all check somewhere, wherever you get podcasts, so check back around that time. I can honestly say that I've got a great lineup of people and topics to bring before you then. On to today's episode then. So regular listeners of the podcast should need little introduction for this episode. It's basically a kind of part 2 of what we did in episode 50, which was a couple of guests and I debate the question of whom we would interview from Byzantium if we had the opportunity to do so, what questions would be asked, what we would be looking for. I actually got a lot of very positive feedback from that episode. Many of you seem to appreciate how sort of giddy we got like grad students, with lots of goodies that we could play with that don't actually exist, but we use our imagination for them. And I had a lot of fun recording 50, and I had a lot of fun recording this one too. So my guests for this take on that question are Paroma Chatterjee from the University of Michigan and Merle Eisenberg from the National Social Environmental Synthesis Center at the University of Maryland. And both have been guests on the podcasts before. I just thought that they would present a very interesting combination of perspectives, which indeed they did. So it's pretty self-explanatory, except for one thing. So Paroma mentions an author, Paul the Salentiary, whom every Byzantinist will know. But I just thought some of you might not know him, so just a quick word in advance about who that is. Paul the Salentiary was a court official. Salentiaries were mid to high-level ranking court officials who were in charge of palace events and decorum and order. And he was also a poet in the 6th century, and he wrote most famously an ekphrasis of Hagia Sophia. So after Justinian had built it, Hagia Sophia in the 6th century, is a long poetic description of the church and one of our main sources for it, for how it was adorned and perceived in the 6th century. If you want to hear more about Paul's work, I refer you to episode 11, where I spoke with Stephen Smith about Byzantine erotic epigrams, because Paul wrote some of those, and they're quite fun to read. But Paroma is referring mostly to his work on the description of Hagia Sophia. Anyway, this is a slightly longer episode than usual because we've got 3 perspectives to present. So I'll leave it here and wish you all the best for the remainder of the summer. stay safe, and I'll see you all again in the fall. Paroma, Merle, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much for having me back on, Anthony.
Yeah, I should say welcome back. I mean, you've both been on before, and I asked you to join me in this conversation because I thought you would bring very interesting, diverse perspectives, like very different ideas about, who you would like to talk to from Byzantium if you got the chance. If you could interview them for, as long as a week, 2 weeks, something like that, debrief them or interrogate them as we had, as Alexander did last time in the first episode of this kind. So the audience knows the setup, so let's just take it. Merle, why don't you start us off? Give us your pitch, then we'll discuss it and move on to Paroma and myself.
Sure. So I really liked your previous episode. I listened to it as I was driving somewhere over the course of the week. And Alexander, because as you said, not only did you pick a great person, but it was one of the most intensely and amazingly structured, thought out series of questions that I think I've ever heard. And Fotini, because I think she really offered great insight into the nitty gritty of the daily life of a person. And you, I would say, went for, I guess, maximum effect.
Yeah.
So you picked a person, right, who was enslaved by Romans and then became a companion of the prophet. So I have a person in mind, and I'll get to them in a minute or so. But what I realized is there was no way I could top the either structured approach, the daily life approach, or the maximum effect approach. But what I realized listening to your interview is that all of you framed your approach in a very medieval, late antique, Byzantine, whatever term you want to use, that you all chose a series of one-off interviews, as it were, right? That you would sit down with someone. So, for example, Alexander's approach actually would generate, if he wrote it all up, something like Procopius's Wars, right? You would have a long story written down, interspersed over different time periods, but then, compiled, edited, et cetera, et cetera. We can have debates about that if you so desire later in his life. So what you get is stories, right? And you get a later perspective. And I couldn't help, as I was listening, I was thinking of the first Robert Caro biography of LBJ, The Path to Power. I don't know if either one of you have read that.
No.
So this describes his early life, and what Robert Caro figures out is that LBJ had been telling stories about his life for most of his adult life. And that when he went back and actually interviewed the people, all the stories were essentially made up. And he found out a lot about his early life. So very much a narrative creation of his own life that he fostered explicitly and on purpose. So to that end, what I thought was missing from the work and the time period we all work on are kind of long-term changes, right? Tracking someone over the course of his life or her life or their life, which we don't have in terms of archival material outside of Egypt or, a few other places that we're probably all familiar with. And here I was thinking of my friend who works on 20th century American history. And what he has is he looks at the history of work and freedom over about 100 years. And he has cohort studies and longitudinal studies, right? Where he tracks people across time and space. I don't know if you guys are familiar with those kind of anthropological approaches. So in an ideal world, what I thought is that I would interview a huge number of people every 5 or 10 years, and then their kids and then their grandkids, and ask them questions about changes over time, right? What do they think about the state? What do they think about their identity? How has the world changed since, their parents and grandparents, stuff like that. Now, I should say, I thought that was cheating a bit too much. Maybe not. Yeah. So then what I thought I would cheat a little bit. And since you never explicitly told me I couldn't interview someone multiple times over the course of their life, I thought I would choose one person, a high-ranking person, who can then give me insight into his life if I interviewed him every 5 years or so, right? And so that's how I thought about the way to do this. And the person I ultimately landed on, because, at heart I'm a 5th, 6th century person, is the Emperor Zeno, who rules from 474 to 491. There's some back and forth there, but that's essentially his life. And I'd ask a series of questions, and I'll get into details in a second, in terms of, as I just outlined, what did he think about his place in the world? How did this change over time? How did this compare, in terms of who he's in contact with? I'd probably actually just ask Alexander for his list of questions. And if the emperor is willing to give me 6 days multiple times over his life, that's what I would use, because I can't improve upon that. I really, really can't.
Sure.
Now, Zeno, I think, is particularly good for this because he, has a somewhat of a rags to riches story, right? I mean, we can debate over how much it really is, but he starts out in the provinces, he becomes a key military general, he marries the daughter of the emperor, and then he himself becomes emperor. So you get a really good feel, I think, about daily life in a province, and then how he makes his way up the food chain. Now, I think we could break Zeno's life into 3 broad phases. So if I was only allowed to interview him 3 times, I would choose each of these 3 periods, right? So first, as with most people, we know little about his early life, right? We do know he was likely born with a different name, right? Teresis or Teres Condissa in Assoria, which is now in a province of the Roman Empire in what's south central Turkey, right? It's a very mountainous region. It's often seen as a very barbaric region. This is obviously what people from the center would think about, say, a province, right? It's under Roman rule for centuries, so there's no way in which it's not essentially thoroughly Romanized. But he's a provincial Roman soldier, right? So to get his view of what his life is like there, what he thinks of people in the capital, and what he ultimately thought about why he was leaving. So that would be kind of the first set of interviews. And again, you could structure it, just borrow Alexander's questions if you so desired. The second is when he comes to the capital, he changes his name to Zeno. So that's an interesting discussion you could obviously have, right? What does that mean about his identity and how he thinks about the world? And he rises to significant office by the mid-460s. He marries the daughter of the Emperor Leo I, Ariadne. So how does that go down, right? I actually thought about using her as the person to interview, but she is the daughter of an emperor. So I thought you would lose a little of that kind of provincial feel. But obviously, you'd want to have a series of side interviews with her about questions of, did she have a choice in this, right? What was her feelings on this? How does this function, right? How do these high prestige marriages, which we kind of just pass off, I think, very often in the sources, but what's her perspective? What's the perspective from a woman who's being essentially forcibly married off to an extent? What's her choice in the process? And so within this phase, there's also a question of, right, I think the key question here for me is, he has a son, Leo II, who is technically the senior emperor to him at the time, but dies very young. And all of a sudden he has a conundrum, right? What does he do? And for the first time, essentially, at least in the Eastern Roman Empire, for a while, you have a military commander who essentially becomes emperor himself, right? Takes formal reins of power again. There'd been a back and forth struggle for, 70, 80 years here. And this is the pattern that will essentially follow for centuries to come, right? That you have someone who's actually wielding military, political, and religious power all in one figure again. And this will continue through Anastasius, Justinian, et cetera, et cetera. So how does that transition work, right? I mean, I'd be very curious, is this a natural thing? How does this process work? We know he has a series of revolts against him, which is probably because of this process to an extent. So how does this change over time? And then the third thing is obviously during his own reign. In particular, right, you'd ask a series of questions. What does he think about the provinces now that he's the emperor, right? How does he reflect upon these changes? How has this shaped and changed his mind? And finally, obviously, you'd want to ask him, he's the emperor in the empire when the West is quote unquote officially gone in 476, right? So, I think most of us academic historians would say that 476 is kind of like a nothing burger date at this point. But what did he think about it? And what did he think about those changes over time? And how did he envision what it meant to be Roman as this progressed over the course of his life? So that's kind of what I'd want to do, right? Interview this person who went from this kind of humble origins, for lack of a better term, although I doubt he's actually very humble. Where he ends up, right? What did he think of his world at the beginning, during the process, and at the end? And again, you could ask him a million other economic, social, religious questions are huge here, I think, right? What's his daily life like? How does that change over time? So again, I would just steal Alexander's questions, but make it a longitudinal study so you have a kind of a deep archive of what this person's experience was.
Right. So Merle, let me jump in here, and I'll give Paroma some time to think of some questions about what, how that choice is situated and how she sees, Byzantium in this culture. some interesting things about Zeno. He was the only emperor to be appointed by his son, infant son, in fact, because when Leo the First had tried to appoint Zeno as his successor, it was shouted down, like there was too much opposition, and nobody wanted him. And then Leo dies, and Zeno is appointed by his child's son because they needed an adult at the helm, as it were. And of course, Zeno, there's all this bad press about him in the sources. Like including that he was physically ugly, he smelled, he was epileptic, he was buried alive, like all of this stuff. That's pretty nasty. I mean, just looking at him would give you a sense of how these sources are distorted or not, right? But I was wondering if you had, if you chose him also in part because of the sort of ethnic angle, because he's an Isaurian, and Isaurians are considered, they're kind of looked down on by other Romans at this time. And there's clearly a lot of ethnic prejudice against them. Like we have riots against Isaurians in the capital. If they're found in the streets, they're beaten up, and things like that. And yet he's an Isaurian, and he has to manage this whole mess.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely one of the reasons, right? This is why I'd want to figure out at different points in his life, what does that identity mean to him, right? Is this something that, a whole bunch of people in the area really agree on, and that this is something that's super important to them for whatever reason? So you could have a series of interviews of what that really means to them. And then how does it mean that he's assimilating or acculturating to a capital, right? I mean, changing his name is obviously the kind of key way in which he does this. But that's exactly right? I mean, I think at this point, we're less comfortable, at least in scholarship, with seeing them as like an ethnic bloc, and that there's a Germanic ethnic bloc, and that they're struggling back and forth. I think that's not the case. But I do think there's something to be said that in this time period, and it's to an extent mostly a 5th century phenomenon, that these kind of big identity blocks do feature more prominently in the sources than they do, I think, in many other periods.
Yeah, and he could reveal whether the Isaurian language still survived. Like, we don't even know.
Yeah, I mean, it's based on having done some research a number of years ago on this, mostly names of people at this point, which is always, problematic. I mean, I always think of this of my own name always comes up because, my first name is not very common. And then my last name, my parents actually alternated last names with children. And so that always made it so that I had a very dubious way of looking at names in general, I will say.
That's a very Paleologan, even Komnenian practice. So what's up with your first name? What does it?
So my parents picked, I have 2 siblings, they picked androgynous names so that they could be, whether it was a boy or a girl, it didn't matter. And that was just the name we were going to get. So that's how they were chosen.
Oh, Merle doesn't.
No, I mean, there's famous female Merles in history, and there's, Merle Haggard being the obvious one, but Merle Oberon's a famous actor.
Yes.
Or actress, excuse me.
She's the one I thought of first, Merle Oberon.
Yeah, so again, that's my own personal, I'll just put my views out there, that I've always had difficulty assuming that names were like strong ethnic markers. I think because my own personal bias in that regard. But I do think that, when it comes to Isaurian names, that seems to be the main basis of what their ethnic identity is. I think probably, they're no different than, say, Balkan soldiers in the early 6th century, right? Obviously, Justin being the most famous, Justinian himself being a Balkan soldier, or dating back to, say, the 3rd century emperors as well.
Yeah. Paroma?
I found this really fascinating, especially this idea of the longue durée. I like the way you've cheated, sort of. I don't think it's cheating, but I think that's a really interesting way of doing it. And there's also, I don't know if you know this famous documentary where, by Michael Apted, where every 7 years he just met with this group, very sort of different socioeconomic, people in Britain from the age of 7 all the way to 63. And see not just changes, I would say, in some cases, maybe not so much change, or in some cases, how just being born in a certain way reinforces your future. So I'm thinking that would also be a perspective, possibly, that you get, if you were to sit down with Zeno every 5 years and speak to him, and, and I have been interested to know what you think about his smelly side, if there was one. But what I found really interesting was also how you brought out this thing of, this man from the provinces and Isaurian coming and just becoming emperor, is sort of sanctioned by his infant son or whatever, but he is the emperor, and how just being in that position might make him reflect on the provinces now. And I find that a really interesting way to think about this, but also how his own relationship to this idea of being an emperor might have changed over time. Because it's not just, now I'm in the center and those are the provinces, but also I wonder, if we could get into the minds of these emperors, how did their conception of this monarchy, whatever, being an emperor change? Was there a really substantive, to use one of Antony's words, from earlier, was there substantive conceptual change in how they envisioned what this state is to be and their own position in relation to the state? And I think that might be something also that comes out in your interactions with Zeno. I'm talking like you have actually met him, like you are going to meet him.
No, I think you've perfectly hit on two things that I always think about from our own sources, which to say, late antique, middle Byzantine, actually all Byzantine for the most part until you get to a late period, we have essentially literary sources that we have to unpack, we have to do a lot of careful work with. And what I always wish we had was more, ways in which we could know that we could chop that information a little finer, right? Rather than having, essentially, we can arrive at conclusions over when a certain part of someone's work was written. And I think there's really great work done on that. But to be able to unpack that a little further, that modern historians are able to do, but then also use the toolkit that we have that I think is far more developed because of these reasons that we have to work that way. And then the second point I think is exactly spot on. I mean, I'm curious about, chopping up ideas of rulership more fine-grained and to understand how they change over time, which I think is something is often taken for granted, even though, living as someone I do in the 21st century America, what the US president and his powers have changed radically over the last 50 years, right? I mean, War Powers Act, et cetera, really make that office very, very different than it was, 50, 60 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, especially in the case of Zeno, who had to face, as you put it, the end or the liquidation of the Western Empire during his reign. And we don't have very many or good sources about that event or how he dealt with it. But from what we do have, it appears that he was caught a bit off guard and didn't exactly know how to handle the situation when, Odoacer, this sort of Germanic warlord in Italy, basically decides, we're not going to have an emperor anymore in Italy, and we're just going to send the insignia to Constantinople. Say, here, you keep this now. And Zeno doesn't exactly know what to do. And he basically doesn't answer to Odoacer as to whether he would allow him to continue to rule Italy with the title of patrician, just kind of nominally under Constantinople. So this is the first moment when Constantinople has to imagine itself as the sole remaining center of Roman imperial power. And Zeno just he decides to pass.
Which I find really interesting. Sorry for interrupting, but right there, it's almost like you have to learn on the job in some of these, right? It really sounds like that, with Odoacer suddenly saying, okay, and in one way, it sounds profoundly empowering that, okay, now we are the last remaining, but at the same time, it's also somewhere disempowering. So it's almost like you're learning as you're doing the job.
Yeah, he didn't have a happy reign too. There were so many coups and plots and rebellions against him. One of them actually drove him from Constantinople back to his homeland for like a year and a half. And they were always plotting against him. And I think one of the main reasons he survived is because the alternatives were always worse. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true, but I also wonder if part of that process is because of the changing nature of what the emperor is or isn't supposed to be and what he does to the office itself, right? I mean, this would be something I think someone should explore in more detail, right? But you go from a set in which the emperor is kind of a religious, figurehead, to use a bad term, but we'll use it for now, to an office in which it really controls military power again and economic power, and that's a real change to the function of the office. So is that profoundly destabilizing to someone's rule? Probably, right? I mean, you're used to doing something, you're used to replacing essentially the person who's running the military at the right hand or left hand of the reigning emperor, and now you have to go against the emperor himself, and that's kind of a different way in which you think about these things.
Yeah, it's interesting you should say that, because I got distracted by a side project now on working out the history of the field armies of this period. No, because I think we've got it all wrong. I really do. I don't want to get into the technical details, but it's quite likely that the East Roman state at this point has the most and the biggest armies than it's ever had. And which might even explain why there's so much warfare going on internally at this time. In addition to which, he had to deal with all these Goths, right? All these Gothic armies of two people named Theodoric, one of whom fell on a spear, so that took care of that. And he just sends the other one. It's like, hey, wouldn't you much rather be in Italy, rather than in the Western Balkans? And Theodoric says, why, yes, I would. And it's like, well, go with my blessing. And so, yeah, Zeno just basically, he had this knack for how should I put this? For getting his problems to solve themselves, usually by having one counter the other.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that's also interesting. As you said, there's a 1.5 million revolts against him, yet the guy somehow manages to make it through them all, even when it looks terrible.
Yeah.
And he clearly has a knack for power politics, right? I mean,
yeah.
I don't think he probably agreed with the most people, right? He's not this consensus builder, most likely, but he managed to survive for decades, essentially, at the pinnacle of power, which is, pretty difficult. And dies, peacefully, I guess. He doesn't die in battle. He doesn't get poisoned or anything. So.
Yeah, no, that's right. And Procopius says about him that, in Zeno, the Romans had someone who knew how to get things done.
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole other religious policy angle that would also be fascinating to follow up, right? But, I left that aside just because I, figured that would be a whole other series of issues. But I think, his religious policy is also something that'd be worth trying to figure out and work out from him. What does he believe versus, what's he doing in these types of questions?
Yeah, my opinion is that it was much more successful than we give it credit for. But anyway, all right. Any final thoughts before we move on to Proma?
I guess I'll throw out a question for both of you. I'd be interested to know about this. So how did he know how to do his job, Zeno? I mean, coming from the how did he? Because I'm hearing this, about how he got one problem to take care of the next, but he survived for so long, and in a time of really some big, it seems, changes, and some substantive changes. So how do you think? What is the toolkit you need to become a successful Roman emperor is my question, basically. Especially for someone just coming, and someone who is coming from a group that is looked down on.
Yeah, I think that's actually a wonderful question, and actually something that, I don't know how much time has been spent on, which is to say, how do these people get mentored, right? Someone's got to teach them the ropes, right? You can piss off these people, you can kill those people, but really don't make those people angry, kind of deal. And I think, someone like Basil I, right? I think there's true or apocryphal stories. We can discuss that at another time, but we get a sense of how that would function. But there's a whole host of people across the 5th century West who do these kind of jobs and rise to power, but how they really learn the ropes is very unclear, right? I mean, my
Yeah.
other favorite ruler of the 5th century is Gundobad, who's the ruler of what we now call Burgundy. It's not Burgundy, but that's neither here nor there.
Yeah.
But he somehow learns the ropes from his uncle, right? And so how do these mentorships work? Part of the problem is we don't know the earlier life of these people, right? They just show up and they're suddenly, the commander of some large army. But I think that would be worth exploring. Maybe this is part of your project that you're getting sidetracked on, Anthony. You could also build this in.
No. The project is strictly administrative. Yeah. No, not personal histories. But no, that's an excellent question. And what kind of human resources did these people draw on? And let's not forget Ariadne. I mean, this is a palace outsider, right? For everything having to do with palace decorum and how to get things done in the palace, I think she would have been his guide. And from what I understand, the marriage sort of worked. It was Ariadne's mother that was a problem.
Yeah, but then of course she goes on to marry Anastasius.
Yes.
And so how does that work? This is why I said I was on the verge of choosing her, and then I said,
Right.
oh, but the provincial thing, if I can steal Fotini's point and bring that in, I thought was very useful.
Great. Paroma, shall we move on to you?
Sure. Yes.
All right. Give us your pitch.
Launch into it. So the person I've chosen could not be more different, I suppose, in origins from the Emperor Zeno, and it's Paul the Silentiary, Paulus Silentarius. And I will say that the reasons why I chose him, I mean, I had some other people on my list, but they might seem to be horribly superficial compared to the weight and gravitas that Merle and Alexander and even Fotini have brought to this. But I think we can find maybe some gravitas even in what we deem to be superficial, perhaps. But there are basically three major reasons why I really I don't know if I like him, but I would really like to talk to Paul. And the first actually comes from a term that Anthony just threw out, decorum. And he was this thing called a silentiary or whatever, who was one of this small band of people who are supposed to maintain order, right, in the court and to look after decorum. And that's something, again, it's a very fundamental question to me. Perhaps both of you know some scholarship on this. How did they do that? One of the things that comes up is that they maintain silence. How did they go around maintaining silence and order in the Byzantine court and its environs or in the palace? This is a court where people at certain positions speak a hell of a lot. I mean, there's all this rhetoric and things. I'm really interested in the role of silence in this whole thing and how they just maintained order. And of course, as an art historian, you see these images of, which is usually of the emperors always standing still. And, they're supposed to be these great paragons of taxis, but really in the living sort of circumstances. I would just ask him, how did you do it? Was there a protocol that you had to follow, that you and your, whatever band of 29 other people or whatever it was? And how would you address someone who was higher than you in the system if they were being horribly disruptive or something? Were you allowed to then just step in and say, no, damn it, we need some taxes here. We need some Galini. Now you shut up. I mean, I just want to ask how they did it. My hunch is they probably did have some powers. I mean, the little things I've read here and there, for instance, in Michael Psellos's Chronographia, how he writes about how Basil II would go around his armies and the armies would complain and say, why the hell are you annoying us so much? So you could actually do that to an emperor. And he would say, look, I need to do this. I mean, it seems that there is a level of freedom. This is not just an absolute, thing. And of course, I've read Antony's work on this, which has been formative for me in some ways to think about this office of emperor. So that is a relationship when it comes to something as simple as decorum, how you maintain it. So that's one reason I would really like to talk to him. The second reason is of course, the mything that all art historians go crazy over his famous ekphrasis on Hagia Sophia, which has been looked at a hell of a lot in many ways, but I think we still haven't plumbed all the many interesting things in it. And I really want to ask him, did you actually see that altar cloth? Did you see it when the light was falling on it? Did you get to go up so close to it? To have been able to see that on the hem, there were apparently images of hospitals. That's very strange to me. Have you heard of altar cloths with, actually the social sort of organizations of that society depicted on them? It's very strange to me. But I also want to ask him if he really liked just thinking about stones. And if he liked thinking, was it something he liked, or did he just felt, I have to do this? This is all part of the great, panegyric to Justinian. But another thing that I find really interesting is the whole marine, the watery metaphor, and why he seems. I mean, it's not just the floor, which some of us have gone on a lot about. The floor is water, it's rivers, it's seas, and all that, and the ambo is this isthmus and all that. But even when he's talking of the lamps on top, I mean, he says it's like ships floating. He really wants to bring this in, the sea. And I mean, this is completely out there, but I wonder if there's really something about this marine motif that mattered in some ways. Was it something that played on their minds? I don't know. So that's one thing. And also, again, to bring it back to silence and voice, if he actually recited this, and some people say, I think it was the Whitbys, Mary Whitby, who said, it was recited in the imperial palace. How much did he have to throw his voice if he had to recite it? I mean, how, these spaces, I mean, Hagia Sophia is big. And of course, now Bisera Pincheva has done all this work on the acoustics and so on. Mm-hmm. This is a space that needs you to throw your voice. What was his voice like? What if he had a really squeaky, awful voice? Was that possible? That you can have amazing rhetorical structures in your head, but the instrument, what if that's awful? Or what if he stammered? I don't think he stammered. Well, I don't know. That's just my hunch. I have no idea. But these are things that I wonder about, and I would ask him. And the third reason is, it's really funny to me to read all his epigrams, especially about the breasts of people. And again, I want to ask him, are these actual breasts of women that you have, spent time with? And he really likes curves. And to me, just the way he talks about the conches of Hagia Sophia and then the breasts of the women, it's just a visual connection. Sorry. I don't know if this is becoming X-rated or not. You can.
No, not at all. I've actually had a separate episode on those epigrams with Stephen Smith.
Yeah, right. His work on that stuff. But I mean, this is where I find it so fascinating. I just like to think of him sitting around with Agathias and maybe some of the others, tossing out these epigrams. And I just feel just this love in wordplay and being able to talk about whatever, the spheres, the heavenly spheres and the conches of Hagia Sophia, and here, these women who he really wants to sleep with. It just makes a nice cross current in many ways. And I can just see him sitting with someone like Agathias, who may have been his whatever relative, his son-in-law, and having a few drinks and saying, okay, let's start and let's get into a sort of epigrammatic contest. And I just think that would have been wonderful. And he just seems like someone who probably was very snobbish, but who might have been a lot of fun if you came up to his standards. Again, this is total projection. So those are the reasons.
No, I don't think it's projection. I think you put your finger on a problem. Well, we don't identify it as a problem that much because the different parts of his work and life are studied separately, right? So the court position and what silentiarii do at the court, his ekphrasis for Hagia Sophia, which there's a whole separate cottage industry, right, devoted to that text and how it relates to Hagia Sophia, and his epigrams, which a lot of which are kind of playful, raunchy, erotic, and all of that. And there's a person somewhere at the intersection of all of those things, and it's very difficult to picture what that person is like exactly as you said. You would have liked to to see how, like, is he sitting around with Agathias and joking about the dome of Hagia Sophia and, oh, that looks like a breast. Yeah, but you really should write it up in more cosmic terms, and it's like, is that how it plays out? And you're exactly right that you have a person who's in charge with a core, right, of maintaining order at the court, and yet he's the person who is making the most noise with the performance of this poem. And this has broader implications for literature in general. Like, how was it performed? How was it heard? How was it spoken? Right? Like, we just don't know. It's like we have the score, but not the actual music.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So precisely because he's someone whom you can imagine having a colorful nightlife while talking about God in Hagia Sophia during the day, he's really fascinating that way. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. I don't know if those epigrams, some of those epigrams are just mental masturbation. I have no idea. It could be, but exactly that kind of thing that you see in the 6th century, and I feel he's someone who has, as you rightly say, that cottage industry has so many different strands to it, though. Just apart from the art historical emphasis on different media, the different things he's talking about, just in that one ekphrasis, just about not even the entirety of Hagia Sophia, actually, just parts of it. But there's so much there; it's so rich. And then this whole question of how much Latin did they know at the time? What literature did he? I mean, he obviously knew Homer and things like that. And how he's using them in just his circle of friends, what they might have done. So,
Merle?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I really like the choice because I think Anthony kind of touched upon this a bit, but you actually kind of already have a three-dimensional person, which I think is actually pretty rare. I mean, right aside from Zeno being ugly or smelling bad, he's just kind of this dude doing stuff in politics, right? And a little bit in religion, but that's politics too. And so what you've actually touched upon is someone who actually probably was, pretty normal for at least Constantinople, which is he's able to have an administrative function, right? How does he keep that job, right? Through multiple people running the show above him, right? Not pissing off too many people, right? I could imagine if he yelled at the wrong person who then became emperor like 10 years later, they might not forget that perhaps, right? And then you also have someone who's having fun, right? I mean, living a normal life, going down to the pub, like, I think people in the UK can now do again, and having a couple pints with their friends. And so I think that's actually a pretty rare snapshot. So it'd be nice I think I would be curious to ask you, how would you see all these aspects of his life kind of interacting? Like, would you ask him explicitly about this? Or would this be kind of something that you would just kind of chat and hope it came out more naturally?
that's a good question. I think I could just have asked him explicitly, and I imagine he might have said, "Well, why not? I am this very wealthy and extremely erudite person, and I have all these different facets." And maybe that is how a wealthy erudite person should be. I don't know. That's how I see him answering. But at the same time, what I'd like to ask both of you is whether you see a literary output or a historic, any kind of textual output as really giving us insights into the author. Or can we really separate them out? Or it could be that he's a completely dour, boring person who's maybe praying all the time, just, constantly saying paraton onton or something like that. I mean, I'm wondering how we make that. Because, I mean, for instance, James Joyce, right? Who'd have thought that he wrote really raunchy letters to his wife? I mean, I wouldn't have thought it. Not that I've read much James Joyce.
Well, by this point, but I'm willing to suspect that everybody has written raunchy letters, and I would hope it would be to their wife. But I'm disabused of even that. So yeah, in terms of just sheer revelation about what people say and do, when others aren't looking, even I think I don't know. I'm ready to believe anybody that anybody has done anything. In other words, all the options are open. He could be any of, well, I don't imagine that someone who is of a particularly sort of small-minded, pious disposition would write the epigrams that he did. Yeah, but I can also imagine someone having a tremendous wit and being able to write those and just being incredibly dull in person.
Yeah, that's the thing. That's the thing.
I mean, wouldn't that be really disappointing? Is if you went into this assuming that he had to be, more interesting and exciting because look, we have these great works of his that are kind of raunchy and fun and exciting, and you meet him and he's just like an extremely boring person. I mean, this is not to say that he's boring, but he could just be, very introverted, right? He might just,
Absolutely.
That's how he expresses himself, right? I mean, Anthony, you and I talked about this the last time I came on, but you're not on Twitter, but some people who are on Twitter are extremely, talkative on Twitter, but when you actually meet them in person, they're actually very quiet, right? I mean, this is how you express yourself. And so for all we know, it actually might be extremely disappointing to sit down and talk to Paul. I hope that wouldn't be the case.
That's absolutely true. I agree. Yeah. And that would be a revelation in itself, in that sense, again, about a person's relationship to words, I suppose, and how they wield them, where they wield them.
Yeah. I mean, Paroma raises, I think this is like a fundamental question in the study of ancient and pre-modern, well, literature in quotation marks, the texts that we have, right? In the sense that it is extremely risky to identify the persona that's projected in the text with that of the author, which was something that was done sort of habitually, down to the 20th century. And I had a teacher in college once who remarked offhand, but it was for me a revolutionary comment. I mean, it completely changed the way I read text, which was that there are only 3 people from antiquity whose personalities we can even begin to glimpse from their writings. And those are Cicero, the Emperor Julian, and St. Augustine. And that everything else, everybody else that we have is a crafted persona by genre, by occasion, by whatever, rhetorical needs of the moment, call it what you will, from which you cannot infer personality. But those 3 people, if you read all their works, and I think he was right, there's a reasonable expectation that you can kind of predict what their personality would be if you met them. But for no one else, which is, I don't know, it's both horrifying and I don't know. Anyway, yeah, no, those people, they're kind of locked away for us.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's Augustine, Julian, and Cicero.
Cicero, yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, I think what we often do, at least I know I do, to go back to my example of Gundabad, who I have positive thoughts for, but he killed his brother, right? I mean, so what do you do with that?
Well, like in person with an axe, or have some people do it?
I mean, it wasn't the nicest way to be done. I don't think it was in person with an axe. So it's unclear, right? The sources are later.
All right.
But, he had him killed, right? I mean, so what do you do with, as you say, these figures, right? And you can't infer feeling or what their actual emotions are, right? But I think we often, especially if you start, as many of us do, reading the works or studying one smaller place, you do come to identify, for better or worse, with your main actors.
I think that's another interesting thing, which as historians I would ask you, do you find that, when students are told something like this, say, someone had their brother killed, say a president or a prime minister now in our time, or even 50 years ago, they would take it as somehow being more serious. It's a serious impediment to their perhaps disliking the head of state who did that, than when it happened 1,000 years ago, right? I mean, do you find that thing? I'm just asking because, it brings me to this, somehow I'm jumping ahead, but this whole thing of, say, trigger warnings, which they really tell modern and contemporary historians to be careful about, say, if they're talking about the Holocaust, or if they're talking about the partition of India by the British and things like that, when they're showing, things like that. But no one has ever told me to give a trigger warning when I show really graphic images of the crucifixion of Christ, of which you have some in the Western medieval tradition. And I've always wondered, shall I? But I've never had to. Never had to. Or if I show images of the massacre of the innocents. Nobody has ever told me. And no student has ever said, I'm really traumatized by this. And sometimes I wonder, I mean, I don't know whether I should. I have no idea. And it seems to me it's, again, a relationship with how far an event is in some ways. And is that even valid? I mean, can we... which is why I find, Merle, your comment that, what do I do with the fact that this guy had his brother killed, really interesting.
Well, I mean, so it's the Massacre of the Innocents. I started laughing, and I'm sorry. I don't think the event itself is funny, but every time I hear that, I can't not recall this incident where the Emperor Alexius Komnenos, right? So, and I think this was in the late 11th century, the 1090s, and he was being harassed by these monks from Mount Athos who wouldn't stop coming to the court to complain about these, pastoral populations, Vlachs probably, who were moving into the lands that Athos owned. And they had women and children. And, the Athenites had this thing about, not allowing women and children around for, temptation. And they kept sending monks to the court to complain about the presence of these women and children, especially the children, or young teenagers or whatever. And at some point, Alexius got really, really tired of the persistent, this harassing monks who just wouldn't stop pestering him about this. And he bursts out, "What do they think I am, Herod, to solve their problems?"
That's great.
Yeah. All right.
That's great. Where did you find it? Where can I read it?
This is in a collection. It's a dossier of documents and letters that survives. It was put together in the 12th century about Athos. I can send you the it hasn't been translated or really even studied much.
Wow.
But it's like the scandal of the Vlachs. Yeah.
So, answer your question directly about what I put on the screen or what I don't. I do now actually, I teach a lot of plague pandemic stuff as well. And so if I'm going to put up images of skeletons, which I've cut back on quite a bit, but I do think for some context as necessary, I do say the next slide has images of skeletons. So if that's something that bothers you, please feel free to look away. I often show images, if it's in a classroom setting, of what a bubo looks like from bubonic plague.
Right.
That's not the most visually pleasing image, so I warn about that. Things like that. If it's in an academic talk, I'm less likely to, although maybe you could make a case that I should also do it for that as well.
Well, obviously, these things are contextual. I mean, we basically have to guess what is likely to trigger students based on what traumas they're likely to have had. And a pandemic is, definitely a good idea, right? But maybe you're a Germanic warlord burying his axe in the skull of his brother is not, I mean, how many of us have that experience in our family, right? So you mentioned the cross, which, or the images of the crucifixion rather, which is interesting because I can imagine all kinds of ways in which that might trigger people, ranging from their religious upbringings to the fact that this is a religious image. And I can imagine, like in the Middle Ages, people, how should I put this, investing emotionally so much in the crucifixion that it does trigger them. I find that less likely today, but who knows, right?
Yeah, exactly. And when you think about it, I'm pretty immune to it. But it's a really dreadful way to die.
Yeah, that's what Mel Gibson was trying to do in The Passion, right? I mean, did that cause people to be triggered? do we have Christians who are traumatized having seen that movie and keep thinking about that? Like, I don't know.
I don't know. I don't know.
Mm.
But I guess again, it's that our own relationship to the past and what is more past than in the general pastness of the past, what is more and less.
Yeah.
So
All right. Shall we move on to my pitch?
yes,
I
Yeah.
think, we don't have that much time, so I'll try
yeah.
to make this brief. And I'm going to pick up from, well, actually, a couple of things that you said. So first, Paroma and the how you drew attention to the problem of trying to understand what our medieval subjects were like behind the texts that we have. And the problem with many of those texts is that the surviving body of material that we have is that it's all kind of normative in a way. That is, it's all trying to reinforce certain kinds of norms, whether in the religious sphere, the political, or whatever. Regardless of what it's describing, there's, good is good and bad is bad. And you might disagree about which emperor was good or which bishop was right or which theologian was right, whatever. But the texts are always inscribed within this framework. And there are very, very few that are not. And I find it hard to believe that society was so locked into these normative frameworks. I think they're a function of our texts, right? And right, for frameworks for anything, right? Be they gender, be they theological confession, be they whatever. And so I thought, how can I find a person who deviates as much as possible from that framework and who would be the best informant about that side of Byzantine life that we don't have access to? And that guy is the biggest con artist in Byzantine history. And his name is Pavlos Tagaris, Paul Tagaris. He's a 14th century, well, any word that I would use to describing would be problematic because he was, like I said, a con artist. Brief, it's hard to summarize his career, but basically he had an ecclesiastical career where he moved from place to place, pretending to be the bishop of this or the bishop of that, being accepted locally as that and parlaying that into another position. All right. And so he moved from Asia Minor to Jerusalem, then Antioch. Then he kept being found out in his scams and cons. And so he would move on. He was posing as the Patriarch of Jerusalem for a while. And by the way, people around him accepted that. Like, he could perform that role. And he performed like ordinations, arbitrations, he got involved in royal affairs in Persia and Georgia and the Caucasus and all that, got a lot of money. He started selling fake relics and icons at various points. And then he'd be found out. And so at some point he went to Rome. He managed to convince the bishop of Rome, the Pope, to appoint him the Latin Patriarch of Constantinople. So he converts to Catholicism, ostensibly. And the Pope, now this is a titular position because, the Roman Orthodox are in charge of Constantinople, not the Latins anymore. But the Pope is appointing a titular Patriarch of Constantinople who's a Latin, and this guy is it for a while. So he goes to Euboea, where he holds this position, more cons, scams, whatever. Meanwhile, the victims of his previous cons are following him. They end up in Rome. They tell the Pope's like, oh, wait a minute. Anyway, he moves around some more. Actually, at one point, he even goes to Cyprus and he crowns the Lusignan king of Cyprus for a fee, right? Anyway, so they're coming after him, and he goes to eventually to France now, because the papacy is now split between Rome and Avignon. And so he goes to the sort of counterpope in France.
Mm.
First, he manages to persuade the Count of Savoy that they're distant relatives. And the Count sends him on to Avignon with all these recommendations.
Mhm.
And he's received in Avignon, and he's a celebrity figure in France for a while. He goes to Saint Denis. He's like received with almost royal honors. And he tells them, he gives this speech in outside Paris where he's like talking about the saint, Saint Dionysius, who's from Athens, and we have all of these relics. And if you will sort of send me with an expedition, and we'll go bring all of these relics back of Saint Denis, your patron saint. And so they set off, and he manages to lose his French escorts at some point, take the money, and leave. Anyway, eventually his past catches up with him, and he's about 70 something by this point, right? So this is his career for about 30 years that we can document. And he ends up in Constantinople, where he's put on trial by the patriarch, the real one. And he has this long confession that we have, his confession before the synod. Now, our information about his life is not just based on that text, because, I mean, when you're dealing with the Byzantine world's greatest con artist, who knows who knows? His confession might be a part of a con, right? And in fact, what's interesting is that the main thing that he confesses to is his conversion to Catholicism. Like, that's the biggest sin.
Which is...
The rest is all trivial stuff. Now, he mentions all the rest, but that's the one that he wants to be absolved for. Anyway, we also have other texts. There are texts in France that mention him, and especially how he swindled the French monks. And he also sold the head of St. James, this is the brother of Jesus, to the city of Ancona. And we have the deed, the actual deed, where he signs it. And I think there's some witnesses there. It's some made-up Paleologi who are allegedly in his entourage. Okay. Now you might be thinking this is like a modern movie or something, or like a comedy historical novel, right? But it's not. These are all actual, documents. His confession is a pretty long document in the, Miklosic and Müller Acta, edition of the 19th century. It's all there. And there are all these other supporting texts. So this is an unusual character for our evidence, but maybe he's not that unusual for the society. And the bias in our sources has stripped all of these characters out of our documentary evidence, I suspect, right? So, like, we've all worked in universities. We probably haven't come across someone who has faked their degree and has been teaching for years on the basis of a made-up degree, right? You know what I mean? But apparently that's very common. Like in American academia, you think, how's this possible? In medical schools, right? Or people practicing medicine with, anyway.
Yeah, that immediately made me think of not faking the degrees, but what's happened over the last, say, 4, 5, 6 months of a number of people claiming certain ethnic or racial backgrounds that actually people have discovered
exactly
that that's not the case.
Yeah. And so it gets to questions. So there's so many questions that this guy, I think, if he were given immunity from prosecution, would testify to in a very enlightening way. For example, just a question of personal identity and how you present. Like, when you claim you are X, how does anybody around you even know that that's true or not? How many of the people in our source record are not the people they were claiming to be, right? But someone else entirely? There are a few cases of this that I have found. There's one in Procopius, for example. Someone pretending to be a general. He wasn't that person, right? Or think of all of the people who are pretending to be some deposed or blinded emperor who's coming back. And like their followers like, no, this is totally the guy. And then his enemies like, no, I knew that person and this is not that person, right? So there's a question of just on a day-to-day or face-to-face level of how easy it was to trick people about who you were, how easily you could just take on a totally different persona, right? But also, I'm fascinated by the question of even in religious life. So this guy could fake icons, he faked relics, he faked being a patriarch, a bishop, yeah, whatever, right? Now, occasionally we have other sources that mention, fabricated relics. This is a real thing, obviously. But we talk about them from a distance. I want to know the mentality of people who were faking them. Like, what did they think about the whole religious world of relics? And I don't know. Anyway, it's just such a different perspective from the one that our sources corral us into, that we don't even have the questions to ask about it. Cynicism and all of that. So I think this person would make a very interesting informant.
Yeah, I have some questions that I started jotting down as you were speaking, and they're probably even more basic. Where does he get his clothing that mimics the office he's supposed to be holding? I mean, or is it given to him? I mean, presumably you can't just show up in a rags and say I'm the bishop, right? I mean, that's probably not going to fly. Maybe it does, and if it does fly, how does that fly?
It's interesting you should mention that, because it is discussed in the confession and in some of the other sources. So he basically engages in a system of identity laundering. So he shows up at a place, and this is most explicitly described in Rome and Avignon. If he can but convince the Pope that he is X person, and in Avignon in particular, so he was arrested at some point in Rome and kept in prison because of the fraud. And when he's let out, so he poses as a confessor, as someone who has suffered for allegedly supporting the real Pope in Avignon. And the Pope in Avignon is like, oh, you're my supporter, whatever, and gives him the clothes with which to present himself at the next marks. So yeah, he's constantly laundering his identity into new clothing.
Okay, so then my next question is, why does he need the money? Like, what is he trying to do, right? You described how he ran off with the money, right? I mean, is this all furthering just another series of cons, or is it just a deep-seated, like, this is fun, right? I mean, we all have fun doing various things, playing soccer, playing board games or whatever. Is this just like a fun game for him?
I have no idea. That's an awesome question. Like, is he like saving up for a retirement on, I don't know, in Mexico or something? I don't know. His motivation in doing all of this is very opaque.
I guess the third thing, and then I said I have many other questions, but the third thing, which I think you brought up, but is actually an interesting question, which, I don't know if scholarship's been done on this. I presume it has, but I could be wrong, which is, how do you identify yourself when there's no state apparatus to do that for you, right? I mean, if I get pulled over by a cop, right, they ask me for my license and registration, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if something like that obviously doesn't exist, or maybe it does at a local level, once you get past your small local network and you're able to travel more, right? I mean, presumably you can carry papers that say who you are, but presumably those could also be forged to some extent. So how does that work? And I assume in this case, right, it's 14th century, there's more connections around the Mediterranean world. So more people can travel, and thus it's harder to actually figure out who people are, versus you might imagine, say, in a 7th century world, it might be easier, right, if networks are more local.
Well, you're right about the connections, but he actually exploits those connections. In other words, precisely because the Mediterranean and Europe and the Near East and Byzantium are also interconnected, he can sometimes find the link to say, like he says to the Count of Savoy, I'm your distant cousin. Why? Because Tagaris's stepmother was a cousin of someone related to the imperial family of the Paleologi, and his first Khan was going around with the name Pablos Paleologos, taken from his stepmother. Now, maybe this is a Khan, maybe not, because we know that the Komneni and the Paleologi would choose their last names. Like, you could pick the last name that you wanted from all of those of your ancestors. And so you would have brothers named, Konstantinos Komninos, and the other brother would be Ioannis Palaiologos.
So what you're saying is, when I tell my story about my name, I should
Yes.
just say my parents had that in mind. Although I'm not sure they've ever studied any Byzantine history, but that's,
Well, it's a strategy. I mean, you can look at it as honoring different ancestors in that way, or as giving you options in this sort of fluid game of aristocratic politics to identify with, whomever. So when he goes to Italy, he says, "Hey, I'm your distant cousin on your mother's side twice removed." And the count is dubious about that connection. He's like, "Well, I don't know about that, but you seem like a very, holy man who suffered because the Count of Savoy was supporting Avignon and so forth." But you're right about the state apparatus. So people are not carrying identity cards. There are forms of documentation that you can have with you, but there's no guarantee that the documentation that you're carrying refers to, you, the physical person carrying the documentation. But rarely we have like some wanted notices that describe physical features, but good luck trying to match those with anyway. So the closest that I've gotten to answering that question are actually some legal texts, and these range from the 3rd to the 6th century. And to make a long story short, basically the authorities were empowered to arrest people certain times, and in order to expel them from cities, specifically Alexandria and Constantinople. So the Alexandrian authorities were authorized to expel native Egyptians who weren't Alexandrian citizens, and Justinian wanted to, reduce the number of people who were crowding Constantinople. This is before the plague. And so he empowered these officials to arrest Syrians and Egyptians specifically. And those officials are called, wait for it, Egyptian catchers and Syrian catchers. Yes. And yes. And so they would go up, presumably just ethnic profiling the whole way. And like, "You look like an Egyptian to me. You have to go back to Egypt unless you have legal business in Constantinople."
Wow.
And the law says that it's the burden is on them to prove that they're not Egyptian.
Yeah, I would imagine you would have to have that in there, right? Because otherwise,
Yeah.
not that I'm saying that's right. I'm just saying that's how you would think it would have to be done.
Yeah. No.
This is a fascinating character. Absolutely. And I guess, I also have, I'm sure I will have many more questions other than the ones I do already. But I think one that immediately strikes me is this actually is the person from whom we can learn about how he wielded rhetoric, because he's doing it to persuade. He can find exactly those points that the other side wants to believe, like the Countess of Savoy, who doesn't quite buy the connection with the family link, whatever, the cousin, but who wants to believe, and he can pinpoint exactly. That's the way he can be such a successful con man. And I think that would be fascinating to see. This is a man the majority of his life seems to be a case of persuading, successful persuasion.
Exactly.
And he's fascinating.
Yeah. There's one identity I just realized now that's actually very easy to prove, and that's confessional. So when he wants to persuade the Pope that he's Catholic, or the Patriarch of Constantinople that he's reverted to Orthodoxy, it's easy to do, right? Because that's what creed you recite.
That's also interesting. It means he's clearly worked out which categories are easier to work with. It shows, this man is someone whose mind, I'd really like to look into, just to see how he's categorized, how he categorizes others, depending on in a way, maybe the most salient identity that any of us carries, which is what we believe in, what we want to believe in.
What you want, exactly. What he could instruct us about what all of these people want to believe, because he was an expert at exploiting.
That's the thing. He'd have been a great secret agent. In many ways,
maybe he was. Like, we don't know. There might be a con behind the con.
That's right.
All right. We're almost out of time. I don't want this to go on, the episode to be too long. Any final thoughts?
This was such a pleasure for me.
I had a lot of fun. I have fun with these.
Yeah, I would say it certainly made me ask different questions and to think differently than I normally would with sources.
That's one of the funnest experiences about this, because we're so limited by the sources that we have and the questions that we must pose to them and the ones that we can't ask. So yeah, I just like asking the questions that we can't ask just for the fun of it, to see what the answers might look like.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you both. And I hope I'll be seeing you soon enough at the next suitable occasion.
Yes. Thank you so much for inviting me to this. It was great fun.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.